The morning I opened the workshop door and saw what was lying on the sawdust-covered floor, my knees almost gave way beneath me. I had to grab hold of the frame of that old barn door, the same one my father installed back in 1962, just to stay standing. 43 years of working with wood, 43 years of Canadian winters and prairie summers spent inside that shop outside Red Deer, and never once had I felt the kind of chill that passed through me at that moment. Drop your province or country in the comments below, friends, and tell me where you are listening from tonight. Stay with me, because what I am about to share still wakes me up in the middle of the night even now, 2 years later. My name is Walter. I am 67 years old, a retired pipe fitter who spent 31 years working the oil patch near Fort McMurray before my niece finally convinced me it was time to come back home. My wife, Margaret, passed away in the fall of 2021. Breast cancer. It moved much faster than any of us expected. After she was gone, the only thing that stopped me from drinking myself into an early grave was the woodworking shop behind our bungalow, the one I built with my own hands. I put it up during the summer we moved onto that quarter section outside Red Deer in 1989. 60 acres of good Alberta land, a creek winding through the back, and a stand of black walnut trees my father had planted when he first purchased the property after returning from the war. Those trees were my inheritance. I had allowed several of them to grow to full maturity because I always thought that one day I would mill them and build something truly special. Maybe a dining room table, maybe a blanket chest, something my daughter Caroline could one day hand down to her own children. Caroline was my only child, 38 years old. Married for 6 years to a man named Trevor who worked in commercial real estate down in Calgary. I had never completely trusted my son-in-law. He was the kind of man who always seemed to have a plan, always another investment opportunity, always some business idea he wanted to discuss over Sunday dinner. Margaret liked him well enough, or at least she made the effort for Caroline's sake. As for me, I kept my opinions mostly to myself. A man does not need to love his daughter's husband. He only needs to put up with him and keep his eyes open. That Tuesday in late October was one of those calm prairie days when the leaves were still hanging onto the poplar trees. The sky was that washed-out blue you only ever see in autumn out here. I had driven into town to pick up a new set of chisels from the Home Hardware on the main street. I had been putting money aside for months to buy them. A proper Lee Valley set that cost me nearly $400. For once, I was feeling pretty good. I had a coffee from Tim Hortons sitting in the truck. My pension check had come in. And for the first time since Margaret's funeral, I was actually looking forward to a woodworking project that might bring me happiness instead of simply giving me something to do. I was standing at the checkout when I noticed the woman ahead of me. She was small, maybe around 80 years old, wearing a kerchief tied beneath her chin the old country way, just like my mother used to wear. She had a can of wood stain, a package of sandpaper, and a single brass hinge sitting on the counter. The young cashier told her the total. She began counting out coins, quarters, dimes, nickels. Her hands shook slightly. I watched her count the change 3 separate times before she finally placed it on the counter and looked up at the young man with a quiet embarrassment that I recognized immediately. "I am $12 short," she said softly. Her voice was so quiet I nearly missed it. "I can leave the hinge. I will come back next week." Something inside me acted before I had time to think. I stepped forward and placed my chisels beside her small collection of supplies. "I'll cover hers too, son," I told the cashier. "Put it all together." The old woman turned and looked at me. And I will tell you the truth. The expression on her face was not gratitude. It was curiosity. She studied me. Her eyes were pale gray, almost silver in color, and they stayed fixed on mine for a long moment before she finally spoke. "You are a kind man," she said. "What is your name?" "Walter," I answered. "Walter Bergstrom, out on Glenifer Road." "Bergstrom," she repeated slowly. Then she nodded. I knew a Bergstrom many years ago. She allowed me to pay for her items. Then she gathered her small bag and walked out into the parking lot with me. I remember being surprised by how steady she walked for someone who appeared so fragile. When we reached my truck, she suddenly reached out and grabbed my forearm. Her grip was far stronger than it should have been. She looked up at me, and her silver-gray eyes sharpened. "Walter," she said. Her voice had changed. It was lower now, serious. "Listen to me carefully." I felt a strange uneasiness settle in my chest. "When your daughter's husband comes to your workshop this week, and he will come this week, you will let him take whatever he asks for." I blinked. "What?" "You will not argue with him," she continued. "You will not question him. You will let him take what he wants." I stared at her. She continued speaking. "But after he leaves, after his truck disappears down your laneway, do not sweep the sawdust from your workshop floor." I frowned. "Not that night," she said firmly. "Wait until morning. Do not touch it until the sun comes up." I stood there speechless. At first, I wondered if she was confused. Maybe she had mistaken me for somebody else. But her eyes were clear, sharper than mine. "Ma'am," I said carefully, "I don't know what you're talking about. My son-in-law hasn't been here in months. He has no interest in my workshop." She squeezed my arm harder. "He will come before the week ends." There was certainty in her voice. "You remember my words, Walter Bergstrom." Then she added quietly, "And when he leaves, do not touch the sawdust until morning." A second later, she released my arm. She nodded once. Then she turned and walked away toward an old beige Chevrolet parked near the far end of the lot. I stood beside my truck, holding my new chisels, and watched her leave. A strange feeling crawled up my spine. The sort of feeling people talk about when they say someone walked across their grave. I drove home that afternoon and tried not to think about it. The woman was probably confused, I told myself. Maybe she had me mixed up with someone else. Bergstrom wasn't exactly a rare name across the prairies. Half the farming families around here had Scandinavian roots. I unloaded my chisels into the workshop. I put a pot of stew on the stove. That evening, I watched the Oilers game with a beer in one hand and my old border collie Duke stretched out at my feet. By bedtime, I had almost forgotten the entire conversation. Then Thursday arrived. At around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I heard a truck coming up the laneway. Not the mail truck. I know that sound. This was something heavier. A diesel. I looked out the kitchen window and immediately felt my stomach sink. Pulling up beside the workshop was Trevor's black Ram 3500. Behind it was a flatbed trailer. Trevor climbed out of the driver's seat. Another man stepped out from the passenger side. I had never seen him before. He was heavy-set and wore a black hoodie with the hood pulled over his head. I walked outside to meet them. Trevor greeted me with the same wide salesman smile he always seemed to wear. "Walter, hey!" He spread his arms. "I tried calling but couldn't get through. Your phone must be off again." "My phone's been on," I replied. "But go ahead. What brings you out here?" Trevor glanced toward the other man and then back to me. "Listen, Walter, I've got a situation." Of course you do, I thought. A buddy of mine in Calgary is building a custom home up in Canmore. His architect is looking for reclaimed black walnut, live-edge stuff, really high-end material. He pointed toward the back of my property. I told him about the trees you've got near the creek. I stayed silent. "He is willing to pay top dollar," Trevor continued. "I was already up this way for a showing in Sylvan Lake, so I figured I could grab a couple logs for him if that's okay." The old woman's words came back instantly, cold, sharp. "You will let him take whatever he asks for. You will not argue. You will not question him." I forced myself to stay calm. "How much is he paying?" I asked. Mostly because I wanted to hear what answer Trevor would come up with. Trevor waved his hand. "We're still figuring that out." "Of course. I'll make sure you're taken care of. Don't worry." Then he smiled. Right now, I just need to get him a sample so he can see the quality. A sample. He had a flatbed trailer, a stranger, and a heavy-duty truck, yet he called it a sample. Still, I nodded. I told him where the chainsaw was hanging. I told him where the ratchet straps were stored. I reminded him about the electric fence near the creek because the bulls were still grazing in that pasture. Trevor looked relieved. He stepped forward and gave me a quick hug. The kind of hug a man gives when he is happy he didn't have to earn something. Then he and the man in the hoodie climbed back into the truck and headed down the track toward the walnut trees. I went into the workshop and pretended to work on a bookshelf project. Truthfully, I barely touched a tool. I listened. About 20 minutes later, I heard the chainsaw start. Then it kept running. And running. Much longer than it should have if all they wanted was a sample. When they finally returned nearly 2 hours later, the flatbed trailer was carrying 3 enormous walnut logs. Each one was as thick as a man's torso. Each one was probably worth more than Trevor's truck. He waved at me through the windshield as they passed. I waved back. Then, just before reaching the end of the yard, he did something strange. The trunk had been moved, and a man who was secretly dealing drugs would never let a stranger help him hide his stash in a floor covered with footprints. A man in that situation would hide his own stash by himself and keep it completely secret. I pulled out my phone and took photographs of everything. I photographed the footprints, the duffel bag, everything inside it, and the trunk itself. I also took pictures of the fresh saw marks where Trevor had cut my walnut logs, the way the cuts had been made carelessly and in a rush, the way a man cuts wood when he does not own the trees and has no respect for them. The cuts were rough and wasteful, with no thought given to the value of what was being destroyed. I went into the spare room and checked the filing cabinet again, this time much more carefully than I had the night before. That was when I found what I'd overlooked. My will, the one Margaret and I had prepared together back in 2015, had been replaced. Someone had removed the original document and slipped a different one into its place. The new version left everything jointly to Trevor and Caroline and specifically appointed Trevor as the executor and trustee of the entire estate. My own signature appeared at the bottom, but it was fake. It was a decent forgery, convincing enough at first glance, but not perfect. Looking at it closely, I could tell it was not mine. In that moment, I understood something that chilled me. This had not been thrown together overnight. It had been planned well in advance. Maybe for months. Maybe even longer than that. Trevor had been waiting patiently for the right opportunity. He had waited until Margaret was gone. He had waited until I was grieving, isolated, and carrying the weight of loss alone. He had taken his time and chosen his moment carefully. That morning I drove into Red Deer. I did not go to the RCMP immediately. Instead, I went to see my lawyer, Gordon McPherson, a man I had known since we were teenagers attending the old Lindsay Thurber High School together. Gordon had prepared my original will years earlier. He looked at the forged document for less than a minute before shaking his head. "Sit tight," he told me. "Say nothing to anybody. Let me make a few calls." While I waited in his office, I kept thinking about the elderly woman from the hardware store. Something about the situation kept bothering me. There was a detail I could not stop thinking about. I took out my phone and called Gordon's receptionist. I asked if she could check an old family name for me. "Any Bergstroms around the Red Deer area?" I said. "Older records, maybe from the 70s or 80s. About 20 minutes later, she came back with one result. Ingrid Bergstrom. She was my grandfather's younger sister. According to the records, she had married a man named Halverson and moved to Rocky Mountain House in 1958. I had never met her. My father had apparently argued with her years before I was born over something involving the family homestead. Whatever happened between them had been serious enough that the two sides of the family never spoke again. That afternoon, I drove out to Rocky Mountain House. I found her living in a small bungalow near the edge of town. When she opened the front door, those pale gray eyes met mine immediately. She studied me for a second and then nodded as if she had expected me to arrive. "Come in, Walter," she said. "I'll put the kettle on." A short while later, we sat at her kitchen table drinking tea while she told me her story. In 1974, her son Eric had returned home after spending 3 years working on oil rigs down in Texas. He had come back with a beautiful American wife and a head full of business ideas. Eric convinced Ingrid and her husband to sign over ownership of their farm as part of what he described as a tax planning arrangement. Within 6 months, Eric and his wife had sold the land, left his parents with almost nothing, and moved back to Texas. My routine and pretended everything was normal. Then, on the 12th day, the RCMP arrested Trevor outside his office in Calgary. The investigation uncovered the rest of his operation inside a storage unit in northeast Calgary. Most of what they found was cocaine. There was also fentanyl mixed in. That part still keeps me awake some nights. That poison has destroyed far too many young lives across this country. Trevor was charged with drug trafficking, forgery, fraud, and attempted murder. The attempted murder charge came from evidence found on his laptop. Investigators discovered a journal in which he had carefully written out a plan to poison me during the Christmas holidays and make the death appear to be a natural heart attack. His friend in the hoodie, a man named Dale Roach, was arrested 1 day later while attempting to cross the border into Montana. Caroline came to the farm the day after Trevor's arrest. She was completely broken. She was 29 weeks pregnant with her first child, my grandson, and suddenly her husband was sitting in jail while her entire future seemed to be falling apart. She sat at my kitchen table and cried, and I held her the same way I had held her when she was a little girl. I told her everything would be all right. I told her she could stay with me until the baby arrived, and that is exactly what happened. My grandson was born that January. We named him Oscar after my father. Today he is 2 years old. Every afternoon he waddles out to the workshop with me. He sits on a little stool that I built specifically for him and watches while I plane the black walnut boards that came from the 3 logs the RCMP returned to me after the trial ended. Right now, I am building him a blanket chest. I am carving his name into the lid by hand. Caroline eventually filed for divorce. Trevor accepted a plea deal and will remain behind bars until Oscar is nearly old enough to start university. Ingrid passed away peacefully in her sleep last summer. After her funeral, Gordon delivered a letter she had left for me. In the letter, she wrote that seeing Oscar in my arms during her 90th birthday celebration had been the happiest moment of her life since losing her husband. She also wrote something I will never forget. She said, "God may be slow sometimes, but he is never blind. And sometimes he uses an old woman with $12 of missing change to answer a prayer that somebody does not even realize they are praying." I have thought about those words many times during the last 2 years. I have thought about how one small act of kindness, a $44 bag of wood stain and a simple brass hinge, ended up saving my land, my life, and my daughter's future. I have thought about how close I came to saying nothing at all to Ingrid in that hardware store. How close I came to paying for my chisels, walking out the door, and minding my own business the way Canadians are often taught to do. I came dangerously close to losing everything, not because I did something wrong, but because I almost failed to do one small thing that was right. So I want to leave you with this, friends. No matter what province you are listening from tonight, no matter what country you call home, no matter how old you are or what burdens you are carrying, be kind to the stranger standing in front of you in line. You have no idea what they may have seen. You have no idea what they may be trying to warn you about. You do not know whose grandfather, whose daughter, whose unborn grandchild might be protected because you opened your wallet for $12 worth of nails and hinges. And if somebody ever grabs your arm and quietly tells you something that makes absolutely no sense, something about sawdust, fallen leaves, or the sound your truck makes coming up the driveway, listen carefully. Listen harder than you think you need to. Because out here on the Canadian prairies, the wind carries more than cold weather. Sometimes it carries warnings. And if you know how to hear them, those warnings can change everything. The good Lord still works through ordinary people standing in ordinary lines at ordinary hardware stores, doing extraordinary things without even realizing it. Oscar is calling for me now from the back porch. He wants to come out to the workshop and see what his grandfather is building today. So I am going to set down my phone and go to him. I am going to lift him onto his little stool. I am going to show him the grain in the walnut boards and how the morning sunlight catches the wood and brings it to life. Thank you for listening to my story. If it meant something to you, share it with somebody you care about. And tell me in the comments where you are listening from and whether someone has ever given you a warning that you are thankful you listened to. I read every comment. And I will be waiting to read yours as well. God bless you, and good night from Red Deer, Alberta.